Hey, how's it going? It's Keith Townsend from the CTO Advisor, and we're still here in beautiful San Diego, Kubecon 2019. I'm joined by co-chair of the Kubecon, and I like to call it Kubecon because it's Kubernetes, but evidently I've been corrected by the 12,000 people that have already been part of this community is Kubecon, so I'll submit. And senior staff engineer at VMware, Bryan Liles. Bryan, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So right before we got started, we've been back and forth just on Twitter and in person about the culture of KubeCon and the difficulty of integrating the two different audiences for a super technical show, but super critical. I mean, it's over 200 sponsors and booth. You walk the show floor. It's in two different spaces, 12,000 people. This is the real thing now this year. Definitely, I haven't been to the one people told me last year was great, but this is for me. This feels like a enterprise conference coming from the outside, but to some of the more traditional CNCF crowd, etc., this looks a little bit different to them. Can you kind of use the parable you shared with me?
All right, so what I was saying earlier is the way that I look at a lot of things, but specifically this whole merging of Kubernetes with the enterprise and the community that created it, the way I look at it is like this. So let's say you have a person who comes up and they say, oh, it's a car, it's a red car, it's a fast car. And all those things are true about the car. But then you have a race fanatic or a mechanic and they come up and say, oh no, that's a 2018 Ferrari 488 Pista. And look, it's got the special insignia on the seats. They're talking about the same thing, but they're looking at it in different ways. And I don't know which side you put the enterprise on or which side you put the community on, but understand that we really need to understand that Kubernetes is not just a thing. It represents a whole bunch of things depending on who you're talking to and in the context that you're talking to them in.
And I think traditionally, I've always looked at Kubernetes as, oh, that's a fast car. I looked at it as this thing is a way to package, it's a way to orchestrate containers and manage containers. But when you come into the keynote yesterday, it's these other projects, Helm, etcd, Jaeger, which I found I didn't know anything about Jaeger until I sat down with a guy who was like, man, it does these amazing things.
It is amazing.
And but that's not part of the core project. So when I get, when I'm in my lab and I'm doing my Kube admin and Kube cuddle and all these things, there's so much more to it. It's really hard for me as an enterprise guy to come in and get my arms around it and say, oh, this is what I need to start out with, and this is the different pieces. I love the analogy that everyone has used, that it's all very, very, very small parts that come together, kind of like Lego or Minecraft. It's very small things that come together that form these complex things that do the complex parts. But in the enterprise, we haven't typically thought that way. We get Windows, and Windows is this huge thing that does everything that we need it to do. And if it doesn't do what we need it to do, we have Windows.
Right. So we've been through this before. Think about when Linux came and hit and Linux in the enterprise was a big thing. No one even talks about Linux in the enterprise anymore. We just do it. So think about this. Linux came out. I was using Linux in the mid to late 90s and downloading it and having it configured. And it still took from the 90s to the mid 2005, 2006 when people were actually like, oh, okay, this is going to happen.
Yeah, this is like a real thing.
Yeah, but think about what Linux is. When we think about Linux is a kernel. And then you have your distributions, whether it be the Ubuntu from Canonical or RHEL from Red Hat. And it took a long time for us to get to that place. But we always had Linux, and I look at Kubernetes the same way. We have Kubernetes. We're still trying to figure out, we understand that it solves our set of problems, and enterprises should be paying attention because it definitely solves your problems. We need to figure out how to package it. And that's what a good distribution is. But this is different now because we don't want to make the same mistakes Linux distributions made. How many ways have there been over the years to package up a Linux application? And even still today, you have debs and you have RPMs and don't even talk to the Arch people or the Gentoo people because they have their own thing.
Right.
So what we want to do in this cloud native and specifically in Kubernetes, we want to keep that Kubernetes piece pretty pure, and we want to take a different method this time, and we want to build on top of that, but at least keep the base of it pure.
So one of the things that's kind of unsettling is the speed at which it's happening. Like, this is happening way faster than Linux did. I remember Linux in between the mid-90s to 98 when I first got into IT, proper IT job, and we were still compiling, distributions or the kernel directly, etc. If you really wanted to play with it, there were people who were doing tricks like blowing up monitors by messing around with the video drivers. Now, what scares a lot of enterprises is that you can get a enterprise-ready distribution of Kubernetes and build some enterprise-class applications, mission-critical stuff on it. And then the fear is that the underlying stuff just goes away from a specific project. Oh, I was using this project for messaging. Now this other project is now the message, the message du jour. How do you help enterprises kind of navigate that fear?
Well, so the first thing I tell them is, okay, because if this is a simple answer, we would have been solved it. But a lot of the things that you're using now can be used inside of Kubernetes. You might have to package them different. They might have different operational things that have to deal with. But what we're going to have to figure out as a community and as organizations providing software is that we're not just talking about open source. We're going to need real plans for basically COTS, common off-the-shelf software. We're going to need real plans for services we don't provide, like what the ISVs provide, and that can't come until we have a good base. And I think enterprises are basically trying to put the cart before the horse, and they're saying, well, we need all this before we even get to the base. And guess what? They're people, and I understand why they're doing it. But what we have to realize is that this can happen at the same time. And it is moving faster than anything we've seen before. But the process that we're using right now to build Kubernetes is making it fairly stable. We're still getting new features. So we have to look at, instead of looking at next month or maybe even 6 months, we have to look 12 to 18 months out, because we look 18 months ago and where Kubernetes was versus where it is now. Or if I go back 36 months and made some predictions, we're way further. So 36 months ago, Mesos was still a player. Docker Swarm was like, all right, maybe this will work. And people were like, well, we're just going to run everything on Marathon or Aurora on top of Mesos. What did Mesos do recently? They got Kubernetes projects. And we just have to realize that we have to start from somewhere, and we're at the beginning. And you don't have to go wholesale on the Kubernetes right now. You're running your software, you're running it, you have your vSphere clusters online, you have whatever cloud that you're using. You're doing that now? Well, guess what? You can continue doing that. But keep in mind that this Kubernetes thing will help you use your resources, whether it be memory, compute, and network more efficiently. And that's where we're moving to. And at an enterprise scale, what's another year?
In enterprise scale, not that's so it's funny. It's in Kubernetes world, years.
It's 20% of the lifetime of Kubernetes.
Yes. And enterprise scale, year, I'm still running HPUX. I'll still be running HPUX a year from now. So there's other reasons for that that's beyond technology. But a year is not.
Well, we have to have a conversation of why you run an HPUX, though.
It is. It's all about whether or not the business wants to make the. It's really interesting because it's related. Mm-hmm. So in this scenario, it was a healthcare organization. Mm-hmm. The application SAP validated on HPUX. It cost $10 million to revalidate the app.
Oh, that's fair.
So do I spend $2 million and get off HPUX? And spend another $10 million spend $2 million to stay on HPUX, or spend 10 million to revalidate it and the 2 million to get off. So those are the types of challenges that get meet head on with enterprise. And when we look at Kubernetes, we're like, oh wow, I can't make that mistake of betting on a project that's going to go away, and I have these other processes that will stop me from moving forward.
Right, but also $1 million, $2 million, $10 million.
It's not a lot in this case.
I mean,
we're throwing those numbers around but for this healthcare organization, not a lot of money.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this conversation would spur some really other interesting conversations about where's the real value, and if we're pursuing value, then the Kubernetes journey, and not just Kubernetes, but this technology journey is worthwhile.
Well, let me go on a little rant about Kubernetes value.
Okay.
And this is assumed value or future value, or in some cases current value. So imagine that you had a platform where you didn't have to optimize. You could optimize based on the application that was delivered. So instead of having to think about how many versions of this thing I'm running in production, your developers and your operations team can actually think about the things that make you money. That is the whole premise behind Kubernetes. If we can abstract this running of software on one or more machines, and then make sure that we have things like service discovery, we can have file systems where they need to be, we can have the proper security, we can isolate things. Now that's actually the value of Kubernetes. Like, I think sometimes we get lost in the concepts of deployments and stateful sets and replica sets.
I've had the same. I think I've had yet anyone articulate that to me. And when I usually talk to Kubernetes, the reaction is typically, you can do all these cool technical things, and I don't care. I can do a lot of those things today. I don't really care about that. Help me understand the value.
Yeah,
I think you've articulated the value.
No one cares, and that's what I think some people from my sphere of influence, that's something they get caught up in. If you have a software that needs to run and you want to scale it up and down, that's a deployment. But you have software that you need to make sure that you run on every single node, maybe because there's some kind of scanner. That's a daemon set. And that's only important in the context of deploying the application. Sometimes the application developer shouldn't even have to worry about it. So in theory, we should be working on improving our stack, but instead of finding better ways to manage this YAML mess that people get lost in, why don't we just skip it? Why are we not thinking at a higher level of abstraction? Because guess what? When you work for a bank and you have 1,300 or 1,400 or 5,000 dev teams, as some larger banks do, they don't care about that. They care, am I making software so I am not losing money on the money that we bring in? We want to pay our dev teams, we want to pay them fairly, but we don't want to lose money on waste. And that's where I think a lot of people who are in the community Kubernetes think now, but then whenever you're butting up against these CIOs, they're thinking at this other level. They're thinking of, how efficient are we? And Kubernetes is a great tool for getting us there, but we have to make sure that we're building tools that allow us to get there, and we got to start filling in that middle space, because it's actually not Kubernetes. It's now what we need is like the grand scheme of how to build software on top of Kubernetes.
I think you just answered my question of why that was the perfect argument against why I hate Kubernetes so much, and why at the same time I'm personally my business is sponsoring OpenFaaS. Like, why do I sponsor OpenFaaS but I hate Kubernetes? I don't hate Kubernetes. I love OpenFaaS, and I want that functionality. And the Kubernetes stuff just needs to take care of itself so that I get that functionality, and we can't get there until Kubernetes.
Right, and then we don't help ourselves because there's a lot of board developers out there and a lot of really motivated people, and we get things like AWS released Lambda years ago now, and now they were first movers really in that space, kind of, and then the whole ecosystem has followed suit. And I actually just had a conversation when I was walking here, and we're talking about serverless, and I said, why do you serverless? Oh, I can serve as functions. And I said, all right, that's cool, but you can do that as an app. And I'm just
absolutely.
And I said, well, so really, you just created something new. What's the good piece about serverless? I can tell you, not many people can answer that question, but actually the real power of serverless is something else. The real power of serverless is having basically unbounded compute to do random things. And a good example would be something like what Capital One does. Capital One built this thing called Custodian. And what Custodian does is it cleans out their resources. It saves them money because they have so many accounts. And then it goes through their S3 and makes sure that things aren't unencrypted. That's the power of serverless. Now our actual compute can scale with whatever we want.
Exactly.
And the neat thing about Capital One that I can actually share is that they don't use serverless functions. Or they don't use it like that. And the reason why is because when AWS introduced Lambda and you had to use API gateway, it wasn't encrypted. So you would basically have encrypted traffic, unencrypted hop, encrypted, and that didn't pass the auditors.
Right,
so what I'm encouraging people to think about is, let's think about, if we're going to think about serverless, and Kubernetes does allow us to do a lot of things like Knative and other things. Right. Let's think about, instead of thinking about different ways to do what we're doing now, why don't we think about new ways so we don't have to do some of these things now? And that's what Kubernetes gives us the platform to figure out. So instead of just thinking of serving, think about, well, now I just have this huge batch processing thing that goes away when I'm not using it. Well, okay, well, hold on here. Batch processing, super simple, and now I don't have to spend any money on it when I'm not using it?
So we're getting the hook. Bryan, we can go on and talk about this. Obviously, we've gone longer than our typical CTO dose. Well, I have to catch Bryan at a later date. Thank you for tuning in for the CTO Advisor, CTO Dose at Kubecon 2019. We'll catch you next CTO Dose. Follow me on the web at CTO Advisor.